So I give you one global comparativist, John Sidel.
Many thanks, Vince. I'm not sure if I could live up to half of what you said, but I'll try my best. What I'd like to talk about today is a book I've been working on and also not working on for almost the full length of my 17-year-old daughter's life. So I wrote a couple chapters on the Philippines and then put it in the drawer, wrote 5 chapters on Indonesia, then put it in the drawer, and now I've got 3 chapters on Vietnam and a conclusion, and instead of going in the drawer, it's off to the publisher. And part of what I thought I would start off with is to give you a taste of why it's taken me so long when I've been actually working on the book rather than doing other things to do more than just goof off and indulge in things. So I'll start off with giving you a sense of that and then actually get down to what's coherent about the arguments of the book. So in terms of the dilettantish goofing off sort of global history, dilettantism of the book, you can see that the Philippine chapters begin in the town of Litoměřice, which is just outside of Prague, in what Hitler called the Sudetenland, the Czechs call the Pohraničí, the borderlands between northern Bohemia and Germany. And this town is interesting and relevant to the Philippines, in part because of the shared field of Catholic cosmopolitanism that you share. That they both share. It's a town with an important, long-lasting Jesuit seminary. The Jesuits in the Counter-Reformation, finding Bohemia a crucial outpost. And in terms of Philippine history, it's best known for as the hometown of the man Ferdinand Blumentritt, who called himself a professor, but who taught at the gymnasium in the town and was a close correspondent and close friend of Jose Rizal. And so people typically think of him as a sympathizer of Philippine nationalism. But you know, it's worth noting here, as I note in the book, that even though he joked with Rizal that, maybe Rizal would marry his daughter, in fact, his daughter ended up marrying a young man who, instead of being in any way sympathetic to Czech nationalism, you might think a sympathizer with nationalism, if that's what he was, would favor. Instead, married his daughter off to a young man who was the founder of a German-speaking liberal party that favored the continuing inclusion of this part of Bohemia within the Austrian or Austro-Hungarian Empire, and favored a German-speaking liberalism instead. It seems to me that this town is symptomatic of a broader field of preceding and longer-lasting connections between Bohemia, of all places, and the Philippines, if you consider that the famous Czech martyr and saint Jan Nepomucki is commemorated to this day in the Philippines by statues of San Juan Nepomuceno, the patron saint of many towns across the Philippines, and the Nepomuceno family of Pampanga, a local dynasty. I think it was his father-uncle who was assassinated when I first went to the hometown in 1987. But they have Nepomarts around their home province of Pampanga. So you can see that the links between this obscure part of Europe and the Philippines are there, perhaps emblematic of broader connections. First bit of dilettantism in terms of connecting the cosmopolitanisms linking Southeast Asia to other parts of the world. The chapters on Indonesia begin in the town of Baku, which, like Indonesia in some ways, by the turn of the 20th century, one of the most industrialized parts and advanced in economic terms parts of the Muslim world, and were notable by the turn of the 20th century for a very cosmopolitan and rich kind of political public culture that combined this famous magazine making fun of the kind of the famous spoof buffoon Mullah Nasruddin, an Islamic scholar, spoofed throughout Central Eurasia. So a public culture where you had a vibrant sort of social democratic and left-wing culture amidst the industry. Here you see Alfred Nobel, the Swedish Rockefellers with their heavy investments in Baku during the oil boom. Joseph Stalin, who spent the early years of the 20th century as a sort of gangster revolutionary, kidnapping people engaged in extortion among the wealthy families of Baku. So you had left-wing politics, very vibrant, and at the same time you had Islamic politics with the Muslim Musavat party in Baku. Thus emblematic of the possibilities for both left-wing and Islamist politics in Baku, which is, as we'll see, relevant to the Indonesian stories and chapters of the book. And we see this up through World War II, and in the early aftermath of World War II and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Baku played host to the famous Congress of the Peoples of the East, where you saw the Ukrainian Jew Grigory Zinoviev calling for a jihad against French and British imperialism, of all things. A call that was also echoed in a poem that was read out at the Congress that spoke about the oppression of coffee workers in Java. And 2 years later, at the second Congress of the Comintern, the Communist International, we see the Indonesian communist not represented in Baku, but speaking of the possibilities of joining communism and Islam as two revolutionary forces to fight imperialism around the world. So Baku, again, opportunistically, idiosyncratically used to introduce the crucial themes of the chapters on the Indonesian Revolution that I'll talk about shortly. And then lastly, in the case of the chapters on Vietnam, I begin, I think, not that surprisingly, in the town of Guangzhou in Guangdong province, that used to be known as Canton in English, which is quite a crucial town in terms of the Vietnamese and broader Indo-Chinese economy by the turn of the 20th century, and is also crucially, for the Vietnamese story, a hub of great revolutionary activism and importance in Chinese history. So the forms of Chinese modernist intellectual activity include the great figures of Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, both of them from Guangzhou. And if you look at Ho Chi Minh, when he arrives in Guangzhou in 1924, I think it is, he finds that it's the hub of the nationalist government and its efforts in a few years to try and reunify China, the Kuomintang. So not only republicanism up into the first revolution in China in 1911, but in the 1920s, Guangzhou as the hub for a nationalist reunification of China, and also a hub of radicalism in terms of strike activity, with the great strikes of 1925, 1926. Also the hub for nationalist military training with Soviet advisors at the Huangpu or Whampoa Military Academy, training Vietnamese officers-to-be alongside their Chinese nationalist counterparts. And outside of Guangzhou, an important Chinese experiment with peasant mobilizing. Where's the figure? I think he's off in the left, Peng Pai, who was here seen in Japan where he was schooled, and returns to Guangdong and experiments with forms of peasant mobilization that are later taken up by Mao and emulated by Vietnamese communists to come. And alongside Guangzhou, the chapters on Vietnam also rather oddly begin not just in Guangzhou, but also in the town that used to be known as Tananarive, today as Antananarivo, I think is how you pronounce it, in Madagascar. Because alongside the Chinese dimensions of the Vietnamese Revolution, I'm also discussing the importance of the African connections of the Vietnamese Revolution from the 1920s onwards. The 1920s, when Vietnamese soldiers and workers arrived in their tens of thousands, I think 100,000 in France to assist in the war effort in World War I, they found hundreds of thousands of Africans as soldiers and as workers assisting in the war efforts. And it was in the early aftermath of World War I that we see forms of intercolonial assistance and radicalism that Ho Chi Minh and other Vietnamese political activists are drawn into, with other anti-colonial activists from Africa. And echoes and inheritances from this period are evident in the midst of the Viet Minh struggle against the French in the 1940s, with the 1947 insurrection in Madagascar, connecting to the Vietnamese struggle in Vietnam. So in all of these different ways, I begin the book opportunistically and idiosyncratically in these obscure parts of the world, seemingly obscure, and I've spent too much time already talking about them, and in the book, perhaps too much time talking about them as well. But there is a clear, coherent, abiding argument throughout the book that actually has to do with Southeast Asia, rather than Bohemia, or Baku, or parts of Africa, or southern China. And here, the book is intended not as a contribution to the study of revolutions in the political science tradition of studying revolutions, but rather as a contribution to Southeast Asian studies. And here I'd like to suggest that the contribution should be understood in the context of two distinctive features of the study of Southeast Asia as opposed to other areas of the world. The first is that we see in Southeast Asian studies a preoccupation with the importance, the imperative of demonstrating the autonomy, as John Smale called it, the authenticity and the idiosyncratically Southeast Asian features of the history and cultures of Southeast Asia, as against the notion of the region as a kind of derivative sort of poor man's imitation of other greater civilizations. If you're going to be an Orientalist and you're an Orientalist studying Southeast Asia, there's an inherent insecurity that you're not studying, the great civilizations of India or of China with their great deep-rooted traditions and civilizations. And in response to this and the abiding insecurity of Southeast Asianists, there's been this insistence and emphasis on the importance of that kind of ineffably, incorrigibly, irrepressibly, adorably Southeast Asian features of the region that make Khmer Hinduism or Javanese Islam or Filipino Catholicism at least as Khmer, at least as Javanese, at least as Tagalog or Filipino, as Catholic. The insistence and the sort of imperative of area studies, as Southeast Asianists have interpreted it, has been to show how the process of localization is one that requires us to understand, in Vince's memorable term, translation as crucial. The underlying logics of Southeast Asian culture and history and politics operate according to Southeast Asian principles rather than according to some automatic imitation of these inherently imported derivative traditions. So that's one feature of Southeast Asian studies that I think I'm writing in some measure against as an abiding instinctive sort of mode of doing Southeast Asian studies. And the second thing is that I'm writing in some measure also against, or at least as an attempt to kind of depart from it in some measure, is the preoccupation with nationalism. And I would say that we see not just the kind of institutional, intellectual response to the study of India, the study of China as greater civilizational, self-evidently important realms of study compared to Southeast Asian studies, but in political terms. The study of Southeast Asian studies from the 60s and the 70s was haunted by the imperative of countering the sort of right-wing, conservative, Cold War derogation of anti-imperialism as just simply a reflection of communism, Soviet influence, world communism, and so forth. And instead to emphasize the sort of inherent integrity and indigenous authenticity of nationalism. And so you can see some of the classics in the study of Southeast Asian history have been sort of built around the importance of showing the integrity of nationalism as a struggle and nationalism as an abiding sort of driving force of modern Southeast Asian history. And of course, this brings us to the crucial classic study of nationalism by Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, which it's worth noting was published in 1983 during what some call the Second Cold War, the Ronald Reagan period, before Gorbachev's emergence in the Soviet Union, and which begins actually with a close analysis of events in Vietnam and Cambodia. So he's quite preoccupied with the Cold War in some ways. And it seems to me that Imagined Communities, after its publication, And even after the end of the Cold War and the preoccupation with communism and the defense of Southeast Asian nationalism against the contamination of communist influence and association with left-wing, pro-Soviet communist politics, that Imagined Communities has continued to this day to provide a kind of template for our understanding of modern Southeast Asian history. And this template operates as follows, and to my mind still structures our essential understanding of the broad patterns of Southeast Asian history. So by Anderson's account and by this template's logic, we begin with sort of broadly kind of cosmopolitan but loosely structured set of dynastic realms that emerge and evolve in some measure over the early modern era. But it's really only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that we see, through the imposition and elaboration of mostly colonial modern states and the administrative circuitries and boundaries of these modern states, the school systems established to staff and sustain these states, and the language of these states that combine to create fields of shared socialization, shared communication, shared experience, and shared expression that then give rise to nationalist consciousness, nationalist attachments and emotional commitments, and thus to nationalist movements and forms of mobilization that in various ways give rise to the independent nation states that we find across Southeast Asia in the decades following World War II. And that provides a sort of clear, coherent, largely compelling template around which to organize our understanding of the modern history of Southeast Asia. But it seems to me that this kind of template raises at least two questions, which Imagined Communities itself and also the template that has emerged in its aftermath don't really answer. And the first question is, how can we explain the dramatically diverging, widely varying pathways to independence, and in particular, those instances where we see revolutionary mobilization, or what many have seen, like in George Cahan's book flagged before, Nationalism and Revolution in Indonesia, as nationalist revolutions. How can we explain why we see seemingly nationalist revolutions in some contexts, but much more stage-managed, clearly non-revolutionary transitions to independence elsewhere? Non-revolutionary situations. So, for example, Lee Kuan Yew once made the very derisive comment about Malaysia's transition to independence. Said, they won independence because it was delivered to them on a silver platter by British royalty in uniform, with a bed of roses. They didn't fight for it. They were just awarded it. It was a bogus form of independence. And indeed, many people from a left-wing perspective, unlike Lee Kuan Yew, derided Malaysian independence as a form of neo-colonialism rather than genuine independence. So there's that question of the varying forms of these transitions and why you have revolutions in some cases in the Philippines in the late 19th century, in Indonesia and in Vietnam, in different kinds of revolutions, but not in other parts of Southeast Asia. That's one question. And then the other question that arises is, when and where we see mass mobilization in these revolutions, how can we understand and explain the mobilization of those masses, those ordinary people, who Anderson actually tells us, as he writes in the first pages of his book, couldn't give a fig for their nations in the making? Because Anderson's book actually tells us that nationalism is interesting, but it's actually much less important and much less all-present in Southeast Asian history than we previously would have thought. That very few people are going to actually be nationalists. Only those people who are, male, literate, educated, and socialized and circulating within the administrative corridors and the educational institutions of the late colonial states are actually going to be imagining themselves as nationalism. So how does that then take us beyond what we now know as the very dandyish, sorts of people in their pressed linen suits, who are going to be too busy, looking good for the camera to actually make revolutions? What about the ordinary people who mobilized the peasants, the masses in these revolutions, when by Anderson's account, they're not going to be nationalist at all, right? And here, as I've already suggested, the tendency in the historiography has been to reach for something ineffably, essentially, in both senses of the term, Southeast Asian, to fill the gap. So Ray Aleto's notion of Pasión and revolution, the notion of kalayaan, a certain Tagalog or Filipino conception of freedom among Tagalog peasants. Anderson's own account of Javanese ideas of power among the youth of the Indonesian Revolution. Recognize the face? And also, I think, quite revealingly, Alexander Woodside's wonderful quote in his book on community and revolution in Vietnam. No amount of statistics, rhetoric, or social science theory can explain the Vietnamese Revolution adequately if its properties of acute historical consciousness and cultural pride are insufficiently considered. Wouldn't it be lovely if you could just dismiss social science so easily today? I really wish I could. So in descriptive terms, there's a kind of split-level pattern of consciousness, the revolution within the revolution, described by Jim Scott in his articles on protest and profanation, the great tradition and the little tradition within these revolutions. But in explanatory terms, there's a kind of comparative cultural essentialism that we're left with. Little acknowledgement of the importance of those complex and contingent processes of mobilization that draw thousands and thousands of individual Filipino, Indonesian, and Vietnamese peasants into organized forms of armed or otherwise revolutionary struggle, even as their Thai, Malaysian, and Burmese counterparts don't feel similarly inspired. That somehow there's something just more nationalist or more revolution-prone among the Vietnamese peasants as opposed to some of their other Southeast Asian counterparts. And that's not very convincing or compelling, especially if we now know that many of those peasants who were drawn into the great struggle of the siege of Dien Bien Phu weren't even ethnic Vietnamese in the first place, right? They weren't even Vietnamese speaking, much less Vietnamese nationalists, as they were dragooned into service for this great, famous nationalist battle in the struggle. So against this backdrop, what I'd like to suggest today, and what I suggest in the book, is something different, a different kind of template for understanding Southeast Asian history and these revolutions. It's not an original template, but it's instead a composite template drawn together from the incredible work that a wide range of different historians of Southeast Asian history have individually put together, and that it seems to me adds up to an alternative picture. Very little of the book is based on empirical research of my own, but rather on a close reading and comparative analysis of the historiography that's emerged over the past few decades, and some of which was already there before. But the underlying logic of this template is also suggested by the work of Jim Siegel in his book Fetish, Recognition, Revolution, where he talks about a kind of underlying logic of revolution that's rather different from that suggested by Ben Anderson's account. So what is this template? So this template is one which emphasizes not the rise of modern states and forms of nationalist consciousness, but rather expanding forms of commerce, capitalist development, and cosmopolitan connectedness instead. And up into the early modern era, we can see this with the lasting legacies of the cosmopolitanisms that come with long-distance trade. The Sanskrit cosmopolis that Sheldon Pollock talks about, and its impact on court cultures and conceptions of state rule that we see even before the early modern era. The so-called Arabic cosmopolis that Ronit Ricci talks about, and its impact on religious life and the broader intellectual, cultural, and social life of parts of Southeast Asia, as we still see in languages like Malay or Indonesian. And then what some call more awkwardly as sinographic cosmopolitanism, and its impact on state and society in parts of what today comprises Vietnam, and Catholicism, of course, in the Philippines and in various other parts, especially of island Southeast Asia and pockets of the Malay Peninsula and mainland Southeast Asia as well. So there is a sort of longer, deeper history that Anderson already tells us about of pre-nationalist, pre-modern cosmopolitanism that I think is important and that I suggest has lasting legacies, which in some ways are determinant of the different outcomes and trajectories of revolutionary mobilization that we'll see, as I'll try to suggest shortly. But it's really in the transportation and communications revolutions of the 19th century, and especially the latter half of the 19th century, and the deepening integration of Southeast Asia into the modern world, that we see the overlaying and overshadowing forms of these older forms of cosmopolitanism with new kinds of cosmopolitan connectedness of revolutionary significance as well by the late 19th century. So the tightening integration of Southeast Asia into the world economy, it's important to note, did not simply couple colonies and metropoles into ever more intimate dyadic embraces. Vietnam with the French, the Philippines with Spain, the Indonesian Archipelago with the Dutch, and so forth, but rather into ever more intimate relations with a broader range of countries across the world. In the Philippines, we see British and German firms dominating in terms of investment and trade. In Indonesia, we see non-Dutch owners of plantations. In Vietnam, we see the ever-tightened linkages between the Vietnamese or Indo-Chinese economy with southern China, and in due course, in different ways, with other parts of the French Empire, in particular, with Africa as well. The tightening integration of Southeast Asia into the world economy relies on the intermediation of immigrant merchants or compradors from the southern provinces of China, the Chediyars of India, the Arabs of the Hadramaut region of what today is Yemen, plus an odd sprinkling of Armenians and Baghdadi Jewish merchants as well. And this integration of Southeast Asia into the world economy prefigures and promotes market integration within Southeast Asia itself, with the growth of cities and market towns and market societies, connected more closely through modern forms of transportation and expanding flows of capital, commodities, and labor, not always entirely in perfect alignment with the colonial boundaries and proto-national borders of these colonies, but also with various forms of economic dualism connecting different regions of Southeast Asia as well. But even as this integration and deepening integration of Southeast Asia into the world economy promotes Andersonian-like trends of social, cultural, linguistic integration and homogenization within these realms, it also introduces and expands diverse, hybrid, cosmopolitan influences, as seen in the forms of popular culture, which drew into their orbit ordinary Filipinos, Indonesians, and Vietnamese in the making. And here I think that the most notable and well-studied of these examples is the Comedy Istanbul. So if you look by the turn of the 20th century, in the late, by the 1890s, the rise of forms of popular entertainment, popular theater, popular opera in towns and cities across the Indonesian archipelago that draw their influence from cities like Bombay, today's Mumbai, and combine a diverse range of cultural reference within forms of popular culture in everyday life. The same is true in different ways in, how do you pronounce it, Kai Luong in Vietnam, or indeed in the so-called Comedia of the late colonial Philippines. The great epic poem Florante and Laura all takes place in Albania, of all places, to give you a sense of the cosmopolitan points of reference in popular culture by the turn of the 20th century in different parts of Southeast Asia. And this is evident in the newspapers and novels of the period, in the new forms of modern consciousness that we see in these new market societies. And so we see the emergence of mobile merchant professional classes that are very diverse in terms of the kinds of cultural reference and influences that shape them. We see the emergence of new forms of learning, new forms of knowledge, new kinds of schools, new forms of associational activity, new kinds of sodalities, like the cofradias in the Philippines or the Sufi brotherhoods of the Indonesian archipelago. So all in all, what we see is the rise of diverse forms of cosmopolitan and hybrid influences and forms of modern public culture in the market societies of Southeast Asia by the turn of the 20th century in ways which potentially might prefigure modern revolutions, but might not, a realm of indeterminacy. So beyond this shared template that's rather different from that provided by the state-centered account of the rise of nationalist consciousness, there remains the question of variance. How can we explain the varying forms, trajectories, and outcomes of revolutionary mobilization in Southeast Asia? How can we explain when, where, and with what consequences, and how revolutions unfold, and when and where they don't? And part of the answer to this remaining question may lie in the contingent, conjunctural realm of international circumstances, in particular international conflicts. So the Spanish-American War ends up affecting the Philippines more than other parts of Southeast Asia. World War I has interesting impacts in different ways in different parts of Southeast Asia. And World War II, in all of its complexity, has a range of contingent sort of implications and forms of impact on Southeast Asian countries in important historical ways as well, which I'd be happy to discuss further. But much of the answer the book suggests lies in a realm much more deeply grounded in historical and sociological structures, calling not only for a comparative historical sociology of the region, but also for a kind of global historical sociology as well. So much of the answer I suggest in the book lies in the variance in these societies in terms of the kinds of cosmopolitan linkages which are able to provide the institutional or organizational and the discursive bases for different kinds of revolutionary mobilization in these different parts of Southeast Asia. And here are the scholastic cosmopolitanisms of the early modern era, which Anderson identified. So the Confucian-style schools in what becomes Vietnam, the Catholic school system and the sodalities, the cofradias of the Philippine archipelago, the Islamic schools that begin to emerge as school networks and expand by the 19th century across the Indonesian archipelago. They are important in their varying tendencies towards integration or autonomy or evaporation really, vis-a-vis the modern colonial states which emerge and evolve from the middle of the 19th century onwards. And here, what really matters beyond these oldie-worldy scholastic forms of cosmopolitanism with their varying, long-lasting lives and legacies, are the modes of tightening integration into the world economy from the mid-19th century, in particularly the different patterns of class formation of both the dominant and business classes that emerged by the late 19th century in the region, but also the subaltern or working classes of the region as well. And it's these underlying sociological differences that in large measure, I suggest in the book, determine the when, the where, the how, and the so what of revolutionary mobilization. So here in what time I should try to stick to, I'll give you a kind of quick and dirty picture of what I do with the different cases I cover in the book. In the case of the Philippines, we see, as I've suggested, the significance of Catholic cosmopolitanism, but integrated into the Spanish colonial state and the status quo, insofar as the colonial state really was built on the foundations of a Catholic social order and form of almost state structure that was in which the religious orders and the Catholic Church were built into that colonial establishment. But with the opening of Philippine ports to foreign trade in the mid-19th century came British and German firms, the commercialization of agriculture, and the establishment of commodity chains linking the hinterlands of the archipelago to the port cities of the archipelago to Europe beyond Spain. And as a market society emerged in the late 19th century with deepening and broadening connections within the archipelago and to Europe, we see the emergence, almost uniquely in Southeast Asia, of an assimilated Chinese mestizo commercial and landowning class, whose ascendancy comes into tension and conflict with the institutions of the Catholic Church on the local level, in the towns, and in the cities of the archipelago. And these tensions and conflicts within the Philippines of the late 19th century overlap and intersect with the broader conflicts elsewhere observable in Europe between the conservative Catholic Church and the rising currents of liberalism, republicanism, Freemasonry, freethinkers, and the like. So you can see this with Rudolf Virchow, the famous proponent of the Kulturkampf against the Catholic Church in Prussia in the late 19th century, who consorts with Rizal. You see this with Spanish Freemasons, and you see this in its significance in terms of forms of mobilization that are possible within Europe and in due course within Spain. And so we see this already in 1888 with the mobilization of local worthies in the Philippines petitioning for the expulsion of the religious orders. We see this in 1892 with the arrest of José Rizal, the formation of La Liga Filipina and its suppression, and by 1896 the so-called Katipunan, a movement whose leader at the time, Andres Bonifacio, remains obscure to us in many ways, but whom we know, among other things, was working for a German firm in Binondo, in Chinatown, who was an actor in local comedia, and whose personal library included the famous French novel of the time, The Wandering Jew, which basically demonizes the Jesuits and the Catholic Church in grand conspiratorial terms, and thus locates him within the kind of matrix of cosmopolitan connectedness that I'm emphasizing in this account. So what I'm suggesting in terms of what emerges at the turn of the 20th century as the first revolution in Southeast Asian history, the first revolution in the region, the only revolution that we see by this time, is not because the Filipinos at this time are more nationalist than their counterparts, or even if they were, then why we see that nowhere in Southeast Asia is the stage set quite like it is in the Philippines for a kind of 1848 style liberal Republican revolutionary insurrection aligned with the culture wars of late 19th century Europe. We see the facilitating Cuban Revolution in 1895, but we see that the mobilizing structures provided by Freemasonry and by the cofradias, the confraternities, the sodalities of the Catholic Church provide forms of mobilization and organization that are connected not to the colonial state, but rather to a broader form of Catholic cosmopolitanism. But we can also see that these forms of mobilization are not organized in ways which are going to hold things together in terms of the egalitarian promise of revolutionary mobilization. And indeed, that the kind of mobilization that we see crumbles in the face of the superior military and organizational might of the United States. It bursts out in those parts of the Philippines where these kinds of developments are most pronounced, in and around Manila and the market societies spreading out from Manila, but it crumbles in the face of American military might and is easily not only pacified in violent terms over several years, but is demobilized through the essential pacification through domestication of those leaders of the revolution whose Republican and liberal aspirations to enjoy the fruits of local office, freed from the shackles and the constraints of the Catholic Church as it was embedded in the colonial order, can then assume fuller dominance on a local level in forms of local office under American colonial rule. If we turn then to the Indonesian archipelago, we can see that the long-lasting importance of Islamic cosmopolitanism from the early modern era, incompletely integrated into the state and increasingly autonomous from state power as the archipelago is more deeply integrated into the world economy over the 19th and early 20th centuries. And here what's notable is that the deepening integration of the Indonesian archipelago into the world economy unfolds under very different circumstances from those observed in the Philippines. Instead of an assimilated Chinese mestizo, commercial and landowning and local political elite, we see a bifurcation between local native aristocracies and a segmented, segregated Chinese merchant class, stigmatized as foreign. Instead of Catholicism built into the colonial state, we see Islam left outside the control of local aristocracies in the state, with schools and Sufi lodges and Sufi shrines dotting the landscape, providing the seeds for autonomous Islamic educational and associational networks, especially with Muslim merchant support for modernist and reformist Islam by the turn of the 20th century. Instead of smallholder and sharecropper peasants, as in the Philippines, moreover, we see huge modern plantations in Java and in parts of Sumatra, and a huge railroad system to connect these plantations to the port cities of the archipelago, thus making for a modern wage laboring class by the turn of the 20th century, providing the basis for large-scale union organizing efforts and strike activity by the 19-teens and 1920s, something not possible and not evident in much else of Southeast Asia. And thus we see two important bases for revolutionary mobilization in Indonesia: Islam and communism. These are evident in the Sarekat Islam in the 19-teens and 1920s, and once again, they are evident in the 1940s and during the Revolution, with the underlying infrastructure of Islamic schools providing and Islamic teachers providing leadership and organizational grounding for revolutionary mobilization in localities across Java and parts of Sumatra by the 1940s. And communist Marxist language and various kinds of left-wing organizing also crucial for the forms of revolutionary mobilization that we see between 1945 and 1949. And it's the failure of Islam and communism to combine forces, not only in Baku in 1920 and in 1922 in Moscow at the urging of Tan Malaka, but during the revolution itself, with the various Islamic and left-wing parties at odds with one another and unable to combine, and instead ending up subjugated to the republican logic of the Indonesian state as it emerges with independence at the end of 1949. So in other words, the story of the Indonesian Revolution is one which needs to be told in a way that includes Islam and communism as crucial bases for the underlying infrastructure of revolutionary mobilization, as I suggest in the chapters of the book, but in which Islam and communism don't fuse as they seemed like they might have begun to do in the Sarekat Islam in the teens and 20s, but then split apart and failed to fuse successfully despite the urgings of the idiosyncratic left-wing leader Tan Malaka, and once again failed to fuse and remained at odds in the late 1940s during the revolution. Finally, if we turn to the case of Vietnam, we see a third kind of case. Yeah, I'll finish shortly, I promise. And here we see that in contrast with the forms of cosmopolitanism that we find in the Philippines, with Catholicism, with Islam in the Indonesian archipelago, that the forms of cosmopolitanism that we find from the early modern era, of sinographic cosmopolitanism, from the Confucian tradition, are integrated into the state in their dynastic form, but then die out by the 19-teens as they're fundamentally dependent on integration into the state as a mechanism for recruitment into dynastic state service. The deepening integration of Vietnam into the world economy from the mid-19th century tightens the links between Vietnam and southern China. That's the crucial basis of the colonial economy. But here what we see that distinguishes the Vietnamese case from the earlier revolutions is fourfold. First of all, the termination of the Confucian civil service exam system by the 19-teens renders no longer relevant and politically salient the forms of more conservative scholastic cosmopolitanism that are still there in the case of Islam in Indonesia and are still there in different ways in terms of Catholicism in the Philippines. We also see the dwarfing of domestic indigenous native capital by European and Chinese capital, given the very tight integration of the Vietnamese economy with southern China over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But thirdly, the deepening integration of Vietnam within a broader French colonial Indochina that's crucial for the prosecution of the revolution in the 1940s. And lastly, the deepening integration of Vietnam into the French Empire, extending in particular across Africa. Against this backdrop, the forms of mobilization that we see in Vietnam tend to favor, through a series of historical conjunctures, one basis for organizing that has connections across the world. And that turns out to be no longer forms of Republicanism that we see up into the 19-teens and 1920s, associated after its earlier royalist versions with figures such as Phan Boi Chau. But from the mid-1920s onwards, those connected in different ways through different kinds of circuitries to Moscow and to forms of anti-colonial activism that are especially important in southern China. And given a series of contingent events that happened in the 1940s during World War II in southern China and in Indochina, we have a series of advantages that those forces associated with this broader communist cosmopolitanism can avail of, especially after 1949 with the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in China next door. So overall, in the context of the broader comparative analysis of the book, the chapters on Vietnam stress the different ways in which Vietnamese connections to southern China on the one hand, and the broader, especially African ambit of the French Empire on the other, enable certain forms of mobilization, essentially to the effective exclusion in the end of alternatives. And it's thus in sharp contrast with the Indonesian Revolution that we see the effective monopolization of revolutionary mobilization by a single coherent agent, a communist party capable of forms of state formation, state building, and of mobilization that are just unparalleled in terms of revolutionary mobilization, far more coherent and effective in not only their egalitarian promise of literacy and land reform and the like for ordinary Vietnamese peasants, but in terms of a command control structure that's absent in the Masonic and Cophradic forms in the Philippines in the late 19th century, and also absent in the diverse forms of Islamic and left-wing mobilization that we see in the Indonesian Revolution. And so, just to conclude, what I'm trying to suggest is that by tracing the different kinds of possibilities for cosmopolitan influences to give rise and root to forms of mobilizational infrastructure and discursive infrastructure for revolution making in Southeast Asia, that we can see that a diverse, complex set of historical conjunctures and circumstances make for different kinds of revolutions in the end. So instead of focusing on nationalism and instead of narrowing our attention to how colonial states leave legacies for the making of politics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it's by tracing the different forms of cosmopolitan connectedness across the region that we actually can more fruitfully explain the differing patterns of mobilization we observe. Let me leave it at that. I'm sure there'll be questions so I can clarify the sort of complex but also not fully sewn up arguments that I've suggested are there in the book. Thank you.
John, will you take questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Could you speak more to the connections Vietnam had with South China?
Yeah, sure.
Repeat the question. I asked if you could speak more to the connections that Vietnam had with South China.
Okay, I'll speak to that in the sort of beginning in the latter half of the 19th century. So as we see the French process of colonization unfold in the latter half of the 19th century, historians have made clear that we should understand that as part of French interests in southern China, and also in terms of what evolves into a kind of symbiotic connection between the Vietnamese economy and southern China. So as France and others begin to encourage the silk trade in the Pearl River Delta in Guangzhou and its hinterlands, and conversion of land from rice cultivation to silk production, you have an evolving deficit for rice consumption in southern China. And who comes to fill that but Vietnamese peasants in what becomes in the Mekong River Delta, and more broadly, to a lesser extent, in Tonkin in northern Vietnam. So there's a symbiotic relationship between what we would think of as the Vietnamese, or if we conclude Cambodia, the Indo-Chinese economy, and the southern Chinese economy. They're symbiotically linked, and indeed, if you look at French involvement and investments in Indochina, they're not only thinking strategically but economically, but in the end actually using Vietnam in different ways as a launching pad for contestation, competition, and in some measure condominium with British imperial interests in China. And in terms of railroad construction, in terms of shipping lines, in terms of their banking, they link economically Vietnam ever more tightly with southern China, which is why I think the level of dominance of not just European but Chinese capital in the Indo-Chinese economy and the Vietnamese economy is even greater than what we see in terms of non-Chinese capital in the Indonesian archipelago. So that's the backdrop, the sociological backdrop. But then what we see in political terms is that as in the late 19th century, you have residual resistance against French colonial rule, that South China is also a base for that. And as we see Phan Boi Chau, first in royalist and then modernist and reformist, and then in due course Republican forms of mobilization, that southern China, and Guangzhou in particular, provides a base for various forms of more or less essentially conspiratorial activity and infiltration of activists and socialization and recruitment and inculcation of various forms of radicalism at the time, including anarchist radicalism, propaganda of the deed, inspired by and abetted by sympathizers in Guangzhou. And those all in the context of very tight economic, shipping lines and other connections between these major Vietnamese ports and southern China. And then by the latter half of the 1920s, this is something which an emerging set of communist activists begin to move in on. And as we see by the end of the 1920s, the emergence of a proper communist party in Vietnam, on and off thereafter, it's southern China that provides a basis for and events in southern China that are crucial for determining what in the end turns out to be an effective monopolization of the struggle for independence by the communists at the expense of various kinds of nationalist parties. So a series of complex events unfold over the course of the early 40s, the mid 40s, including the Chinese nationalists being granted by the great powers the role of occupying and emancipating, liberating the northern part of Vietnam at the end, or of all of Indochina at the end of World War II. An interlude, an interregnum that is crucial for enabling the communists to establish themselves during that brief period up through 1946. So in all of those ways, what happens in southern China, in particular in Guangzhou, but more broadly in southern China, is really crucial. And without that, I think all of those advantages wouldn't have been there. I could provide more detail, but that's, I think you can't understand the position that the Communist Party is in, even the congresses it holds, without seeing where they're located and where these people are operating from, and how they managed to reinsert themselves back into Vietnam because of forms of training and assistance that they're receiving over the border in southern China for complex reasons that involve the messiness of Chinese history during this period. Is that? Yeah.
When will your book be available?
It'd be nice to think it'd be available next year. Yeah.
I have another question.
Okay.
You mentioned that there were more people that were not Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
So, want to elaborate?
Yes. There's a PhD thesis that's, I think, coming out in a month's time by a guy named Christian Cunningham Lentz.
It's just out.
It's just out. Okay. And that tells the story of how, I mean, Dien Bien Phu, we know where it's located is, but if he looks at the process of organizing and mobilization in terms of the coolie labor and the soldiers who fought, and so the tens of thousands, I mean, we already know that Chinese advisors, Chinese military assistance, Chinese strategy, and all that was absolutely crucial at Dien Bien Phu. But alongside that, we now know that in his account, that the crucial tens of thousands, the very labor-intensive process of mobilization for that siege, and more broadly the series of military campaigns that led up to that, involved a protracted pattern of mobilization of non-ethnic Vietnamese, of Thai or other local peoples in that area, into the war effort. And of course, we know, of course, the importance of the communist mobilization on the Lao side of the border as well. So all of that speaks to something beyond, a story of peasant mobilization because of shared Vietnamese culture, historical consciousness, and so forth. That old-fashioned story that Alexander Woodside's account suggests, that the reason why the communists were so capable of mobilizing and was because Vietnamese peasants are so deeply, committedly Vietnamese in their nationalism. When, what we now know is many of them weren't even Vietnamese in terms of their language, their self-understanding, and so forth. And instead, the recent historiography is one which returns to the more sociological question of the mechanisms of mobilization and state building that unfold. Whether it's David Marr's account or Christopher Gauch's account, what's really incredible about this period is the formation of a state, that's capable of extracting and of doing things on a local level, of improving literacy. Or mobilizing, conscripting people for a war effort. Nothing like that is possible in the Philippines in the late 19th century in that kind of organized way, and certainly in the Indonesian Revolution. So I think that's what the literature tells us. So the book by Christian Lentz, I forget what the title is, but it's something like, I'm not sure. He might have Dien Bien Phu in the title. Yeah, Lentz, L-E-N-T-Z, T-Z.
It's called Contested Territory, Dien Bien Phu in the Making of Northwest Vietnam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm just curious, where are you suggesting that revolutions aren't happening? What are sort of the counter cases? You're getting comparisons. You're getting, I think, comparisons of 3 cases where there are revolution. And I think you're also saying, I can explain when they happen in those cases, right? So, they're happening at this time because these forces come. They didn't happen 10 years before because those were absent. Is that it? First, my question, is that what you're arguing in in those cases? If so, spell that out a bit more. And then second of all is, are you suggesting, because you're framing it as a Southeast Asia sort of study, is Thailand a counterexample, or do you
Yes.
throw that out because there's no colonialization, or does that lend itself to a different theorizing given the lens you're bringing? And then Myanmar, Burma, or Myanmar, do you consider that, there to be no revolution, or are you considering it to be an elite revolution given that, Aung San sides with the Japanese, or are you discounting what happens kind of right during and after the independence period in Myanmar, which is highly contested, and I would even argue has, many parallels to the processes that you're bringing up in these cases. Sorry,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
answer what you want.
Yeah, I'll take at least the second one first. So if you look at the three cases that I covered, there's a neat kind of paired comparison for each one of them. So if you look at the Philippine Revolution, you could turn to Siam or Thailand and say, it's the other country in Southeast Asia that has an assimilated Chinese business class emerging during this period. So what happens there? And we can see that by the turn of the 20th century, actually Bangkok is incredibly cosmopolitan as well. I mean, the people who build these Thai palaces are Italian architects. That there's all sorts of cosmopolitanism that one can talk about in Siam. But it's also the case that you have, it's not pitted against a Catholic, a retrograde Catholic conservative order against which you have this kind of liberal Republican antagonism in the same way, and aligned with what we find in Europe, and aided and abetted by those same sorts of people on the same side of the divide in Europe. So I think that's one example. If you take Indonesia and look at the Malay Peninsula, call it Malaysia to be, or Malaya, you could say likewise in terms of Islam, in sharp contrast with the Dutch policies with regard to Islam, which are basically, the local aristocracies aren't, they're not Islamic, they're Javanese, and they should do Javanese court culture and gamelan and poetry, and leave Islam outside of state control. Very differently, the British say, you're sultans, let's build you some proper Mughal-style palaces and put you in charge of Islam. So Islam is far less autonomous in terms of the kind of associational infrastructure that it offers for mobilization. And likewise, and so it's not there in the same way that Islam is as the basis for mobilizing on the ground in the revolution. And you don't see among the Malay population in 1945 onwards revolutionary mobilization among the Malays. You really don't. What you see is a communist-style mobilization, that's more rooted in the wage labor economy, the counterpart to what we see in a different kind of ethnic constellation across the Indonesian archipelago. So that's another point of comparison. And then if you were to look at Vietnam and compare it to Burma, I think that there's a range of comparisons that you could have there, in which, yes, as you mentioned, the contingent circumstances of what oddly, anomalously happens in Vietnam because of Vichy France and its condominium with the Japanese is very different from what you have in Burma, very much, which is a lot like Indonesia, in terms of a non-communist form of organization that then complicates and compromises any kind of communist mobilization that is there. You're right, there actually is a missed opportunity for revolution in Burma, but a different history and lineage, and also set of circumstantial opportunities that constrain the communists from making that kind of revolution in Burma. So in each one of these revolutions is only so revolutionary in one way or another. The Vietnamese one follows the classic model, and then for historical reasons already suggested, only achieves victory by 1954 in a certain part of the country where they had all the advantages, and it takes a lot else to get that victory by 1975 for the rest of the country. So I think that, so I am trying to spell out how a combination of the more immediate international conjunctural enabling conditions helps to explain perhaps a lot about the timing. But in terms of what kind of revolution it is, each one of these revolutions in terms of what is revolutionary about it, how it's organized, and what ends up in its aftermath, is more contingent on forms of mobilization that are deeply rooted, sociologically, organizationally, discursively, on an infrastructure that isn't purely nationalist. And there are also lots of bits and pieces in the book where you can see forms of solidarity, network, and support from outside the country that really make a difference. So for crazy historical reasons, you have the Dutch fleet ends up in Australia during World War, the inter-island fleet, and when they want to transport soldiers back to Indonesia in 1945 to reclaim Indonesia, they had also brought all these political prisoners to Australia, who then organize what ends up being this fantastic kind of strike in which you have Australians refusing to allow the Dutch ships to leave Australia. It's not until March 1946 that the Dutch fleet succeeds in bringing back troops and material for its reclaiming of the archipelago. So there are all sorts of things like that matter, that we could say are conjunctural and idiosyncratic and circumstantial. But the underlying historical sociology, I think, matters. And I think that in terms of this crucial thing, I think maybe I wasn't sufficiently clear about it, but if you look at the underlying infrastructure that these different sort of pre-modern, cosmopolitan, essentially scholastic linkages provide, school networks, and that in the Vietnamese case, they really provide the basis for forms of mobilization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These regular exams held are ones which mean that people in different towns and villages all the way up are connected to one another and can organize and resist and mobilize. But that's wiped out in the 19-teens, a decade after it's wiped out in China, and it's no longer there. But it's there in terms of Islam. All around the Indonesian archipelago, the Islamic schools that had grown and evolved in their complexity provided a basic infrastructure for organizing the revolution. And so the history that Indonesian nationalists have given, that, the revolution, the Islamists were traitors to the revolution, the communists were traitors to the revolution, is nonsense. Both without the communists and without without Islam, the revolution would never have had an infrastructure for mobilizing the way that it did. But they were different infrastructures, and it wasn't just the communists who didn't have all the advantages that their Vietnamese counterparts had for circumstantial reasons. There also wasn't the counterpart to Islam in sociologically. To check and provide a sort of countervailing institutional basis to communist mobilization in Vietnam.
I'm fascinated by the fact that you stress both in the Philippines and in Indonesia the role of religious organizations. You are framing that in terms of what you're calling the sociology of it, the infrastructure, the schools, the associations. I know Vince has a graduate student working with him on political emotions.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what else did these religious traditions bring in terms of values, political emotions, worldviews, ideology? What kinds of contributions are they making?
Yeah, great question. I think in all sorts of ways, it's evident there. There's a recent PhD thesis, hopefully soon to be published, by Kevin Fogg about Islam and the Indonesian Revolution. And so it's not only that we have this kind of infrastructure that I've emphasized, but also in terms of a call to jihad and things like that. And for some people, the idea, soon to be dashed and disappointed, that the kind of freedom that would be anticipated and the kind of egalitarian promise of a revolution was one inflected with an Islamic kind of future, with Islamic forms of leadership local charismatic leadership of the Islamic scholars with their students. So I think, yeah, it was there in a very palpable, face-to-face, personal, emotional way in what people thought they were fighting for. And if we look at what we know about the Philippine Revolution, in say, for example, either Ray Aleto's version or Mila Guerrero's version or contested versions of that these cofradias, provided the basis for alternative katipunans to the katipunan that was captured by local elites, and that forms of local charismatic leadership and forms of religiosity that were at odds with and provided a different understanding of a kind of revolutionary brotherhood were in tension with the main katipunan that tried to hold it all together among a set of local worthies, essentially. But I probably don't capture that in the book that much better than I'm doing now, because it's at some distance, and the historical record doesn't always give us a full flavor of that on the ground, of course.
I thought it was great, and I have to think about this much more. But of course, let me talk a little bit about, or give you a little bit of a pushback perhaps on Vietnam. I think this, your emphasis on the civil service examinations being abolished in the 19-teens, I'm not so sure I want to follow you as kind of a really big change event, because one thing when you talk about French Indochina, you have to talk about the existence of a separate Cochin China of southern Vietnam that is carved away from the Vietnamese kingdom by 1865, where there's no more need for civil service examinations. So I mean, a whole chunk of Vietnamese subjects, formerly subjects to the king, are now suddenly subjects to the French,
Right.
and thrown in a very different environment. And it is Cochin China, in fact, that provides a lot of these early crucial linkages to southern China in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Right, through Sinophone networks, Jolan, the Chinese sector of Saigon, provides a huge nodal point in these. My second, and these are random thoughts. My second.
That doesn't sound random. That sounds systematic.
So my second thought was, in the Vietnamese case, 20th century mobilizers and those who are being mobilized had kind of a sense of that space that existed before the French artificially divided it up. And I would think that, yes, we can say nationalism is all performance and pretense, and but in the Vietnamese case, there was a sense that there was a unit before that arguably should be restored. Right? And it drives a lot of people, not just communists. It drives,
All the
anti-communist
nationalists,
as well. And that's quite different, of course, from Indonesia, which has to kind of learn to think Indonesian, right, across the many islands, where Java has to take a step down to make it possible to imagine Indonesia. So my third thought was, so we talk about nationalism, of course, as this kind of pretense that invents traditions, that thinks back in time as if the nation was always there, that talks about the nation and forgets the many ethnicities that are not really integrated into that at all. But I mean, similarly, colonial states, in many ways, were very pretensed as well. Right? They were not oftentimes very formidable. It was much more show than real institutional or military power.
Yeah.
And so when you compare those three revolutions, the Filipino one 50 years earlier, in fact, I mean, that the remnant of the Spanish colonial state, I would have a hard time comparing to the much more sophisticated structures of the Dutch and the French colonial states. And so, sorry, I'm going to stop here. 3 early responses.
No, I think all those are important, but in the first instance, if you go back to the point about, you're having even more decades in which the old Confucian civil service exam is no longer there, I think that I think helps to further strengthen the point that, in contrast, to go back to link it to your last point, if by the 1930s we look at the Indonesian archipelago and say, yeah, the Dutch colonial state's doing really well, that there's very little evidence in the 1930s of large-scale, protest, disturbances, organizing. And yet, one thing that's happening in the 1930s is more and more Islamic schools are being founded. So when World War II hits out of the blue, and all the contingent things that happen then that are necessary for these preconditions to prove, operative in a revolutionary situation to be there, that infrastructure is on the ground in a way that, as you rightly said, it's not at all and hasn't been for a long time in Cochin China, and is also a few decades wiped off the map. And that I think that, even if you had a stronger local business class and mercantile class, for them to convert their commercial networks into something that has associational, sort of bite, meant that those various nationalist parties that are there trying to do something with Kuomintang patronage in Yunnan province or Guangxi at the end of the war, they don't really have that kind of infrastructure to work with. Whereas when, basically when Sukarno and Hatta declare Indonesian independence, they then immediately say, oh, we have to form political parties. And Masyumi for the Muslims, different left-wing parties. There's a whole, people can can build what they call political parties that connect the local to the national because there's an infrastructure on the ground. And those kinds of sociological connections rely on something outside of the state. So I agree with you that the states are, we shouldn't exaggerate the states, but it's precisely for that reason that we need to look more closely on what's there in society in terms of these forms of non-state social, connectedness that are really emerging during this period. Yes, and then, yeah.
Oh, listen. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Vince. So it strikes me that you've just, in your talk, decimated the field of post-colonial studies, which is all about the binary, right, and the identity being developed in relation to opposition and resentment, right, and you painted this much more complex story. But at any rate, what I wanted to ask about was if you can say anything at all about the trajectory of Islam in Indonesia, because it seems to me that you talked about Islam providing the structures for nationalism and revolution and the infrastructure, but right now what we seem to have is an anti-nationalist Islamic formation in Indonesia. The groups that want a caliphate or independence or whatever, want the end of the Indonesian state, and so I just wondered how we got from what you were describing to the present moment.
I don't see much promise or threat in that in Indonesia, given I think there are very few people actively involved in that in Indonesia, but I think
It's an imagination,
okay,
right?
yeah,
It's imagination.
sure, but I think there is a connection, and I would say one thing I didn't emphasize enough in the talk is that if you look at the different bases for mobilization that I'm identifying here that are not purely, they're not only or especially nationalist. That what's crucial there, and what's also crucial in Anderson's account of nationalism, is a kind of egalitarian ethos. I mean, Anderson basically says nationalism is republicanism. You can't be a Saudi nationalist unless you say, what's this with the country named after a family? I love this country, but I hate those damn, the Saudi family. That's a necessary condition. And in each one of these instances, Islam, like communism, provides a certain kind, or like, the republicanism of the Katipunan, provided a certain kind of egalitarianism. These were merchants who said, damn the aristocracy, Islam provides a basis for egalitarian brotherhood, maybe sisterhood, and it's there, in a way, in class terms that's important, and has that imagined horizontal feature to it that transcends the boundaries. But in case after case, following the logic of Jim Siegel's book, Fetish, Recognition, Revolution, the victory for the revolution means the construction of a state and the reassertion, the reconstruction of the forms of hierarchy and patriarchy and authoritarian control that come with getting your state. So yeah, most obviously, the Vietnamese Revolution wins and has all sorts of egalitarian promise in terms of literacy and land reform and so forth, but it also means a Leninist party state that's very hierarchical. And Islam, likewise, had that within it, simultaneously forms of egalitarian promise and mobilization, but also forms of hierarchy and patriarchy within it. But whether it's Islam or otherwise, what happens after the Indonesian Revolution is the Indonesian state triumphs. Over us. It first says Masyumi, wrong. The communists, wrong. So the egalitarian emancipatory promise of Islam and communism are then suppressed. And that's the logic of nationalism, that insofar as you get your new nation state, you get a new state for whom various forms of egalitarian mobilization have to be suppressed. So I think that's part of the story of the extinguishing of mobilizational forms of Islam and the narrowing, the reconstitution of forms of hierarchy.
Of course, you could probably say that about republicanism too.
Yeah, absolutely. So and that's why when the Americans come along and say, well, the first thing they do is they hold local elections.
Yeah.
And so the same people who are fighting for the revolution then immediately become the mayors and the governors and the congressmen and take over the lands that the religious orders previously had.
There's this great irony in your talk, which I really fascinating, where cosmopolitanism is predicated on connections, capitalist and otherwise, circulation of people, of ideas, et cetera, and therefore, as you nicely put it, with cosmopolitanism, you have the opening up of large areas of indeterminacy. You'll never know who you're going to see in the cafe tonight, or what's going to show up in the newspaper, right? This is all, and that's, in some ways, you could say that's the essence of cosmopolitanism, is the formation of these large areas of indeterminacy because of the material conditions that on the other hand, revolution is about mobilization, it's about organization, it's about command and control, right? So cosmopolitanism arguably sets the conditions of possibility for revolution, but revolution guarantees the end of cosmopolitanism.
Or it's
containment.
It's domestication.
It's reification into something called the nation state.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that's there in
Yeah.
Siegel's Fetish,
Exactly.
Recognition, Revolution.
Exactly. And you can say that about Southeast Asia, you can say that about the United States of America, you can say that about Western Europe, you can say that about the Soviet Union. This is a general law of how we get fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
Despite our fondest wishes of emancipation, we're all doomed.
What's happened before that?
But the one way in which it was, Mao tried to destroy that
Exactly.
logic.
Perpetual revolution.
Right, perpetual revolution, tearing down the state
Yeah.
time after time, and that got us into a lot of messes as well, right? So.
Yeah.
One more quick comment. I don't know how central this is to your argument, but you seem to be suggesting that the identities, so the fact that there are people from different localities, different ethnicities, and so on, who are participating in these nationalist movements, somehow detracts from the idea that they could be nationalist movements. I think that's what you were suggesting at one point, at least in the Vietnam example. And I'm not questioning that, and I guess I am, so I'm saying, when I look around at nationalist movements, and maybe this supports your argument, or maybe it, complicates it, I don't know, but that seems to be always the case, right? And I'm not sure that that necessarily detracts from them being nationalist. And, so just in a case like Thailand, for example, you see, the Northeast sort of rebellion, the Lao rebellion of the last, kind of 15 years, it's led by Southerners, right? Who are their, kind of opponents, at least, in the current political context. And then their ultimate patron, the Sino-Thai elite, or part of it, right? And then making explicit calls to Northeastern sort of, ethnic claims. And then, you see that throughout. So I'm wondering, where is that sort of how to think about that, and whether, that does sort of undermine the idea of nationalism, or strengthens it in a way? Is it that the outsider can sort of see a nationalism or try to benefit from it in a way that someone who's of that nation can't quite conceptualize it, or would be, it would be undermined if they were to use it too forcefully or directly? So I don't know. These are just some thoughts.
I would link your question to Christoph's earlier one about so what if in fact we were to try and make something more of the possibility that the more strongly, clearly envisaged Vietnam among a set of Vietnamese revolution makers and nationalists of different stripes, that compared to Indonesia something had a historical significance. And how would we demonstrate that? I'm not suggesting that that there weren't people who were fighting for an independent Vietnam or an independent Indonesia or an independent Philippines, but rather that's insufficient for explaining a whole bunch of things about what that Indonesia or Vietnam or Philippines was going to look like, or what it actually looked like in terms of processes and trajectories and outcomes of revolutionary mobilization. And Anderson is clearly right in a wide range of ways, including that these nation states have continued to remain. A crucial piece of evidence is that decades after he argued that that there's all the reason to think that these nation states will remain as such, that they have. And contrary to people who thought, oh, these are going to fall apart, where across the bogus nation-state boundaries around the world have we seen actually new nation states emerge? Very rarely, and under according to a particular logic. So I'm not saying that nationalism doesn't matter, and it doesn't bound the ways in which people are organizing their mobilization, especially in an international system that forces you. Even ISIS is in a way trying to create a nation state. But I think there's something else that helps to explain the differences in terms of what and what doesn't happen.
Well, we have seen new states emerge in a few places, in South Sudan.
Right.
And we have seen states collapse that were arguably phony colonial states that have.
Like, for example,
Somalia.
Yeah, but they didn't collapse because of their internal. They collapsed for other reasons other than something artificial.
Well, there's always a bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Arguably there wasn't enough power behind the force holding it together.
But in the case of Somalia, we know it of all the countries in Africa, it has the greatest ethnic, linguistic, religious homogeneity. And in fact, there are people who feel strongly Somali in neighboring Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Seattle. I think most of the new states that have been formed, most of the states that have fallen apart, it's been federal systems that have fallen apart into their constitutive, predetermined and already reified forms of nationalism.
But that certainly would be true in Somalia, where there's functional
in Somaliland.
Regional governments in parts of the
right.
country.
So I think maybe this is a good place to thank John, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.